Hello, this is a short recording primarily aimed at the members of the Suffolk Jungian Circle. We've got a planned session coming up online to discuss a different aspect of Jungian theory each month, and we're going to be starting by looking at the various thinking, feeling, sensing and intuitive types, and discussing a different one each month as we go along, and then move on to other subjects after that. So this first month is going to be looking at the thinking function, and I thought it would be an idea to make a short recording just to explore a few key ideas so that people who are intending to participate can have a listen, and then we'll have a basis from which we can discuss those ideas, so that hopefully everyone will be familiar with the various bits of jargon being used. I'm sure a lot of you already are familiar anyway, but obviously there might be people with different levels of understanding and experience of Jungian thought. Some of them perhaps very, very experienced, and others maybe only recently started looking into Jung, who are less familiar with the terminology. So this is sort of aimed at getting everyone on roughly the same page in terms of understanding terminology and so forth. And of course it might be of interest to other people who are not members of the Suffolk Jungian Circle, who just fancy exploring these ideas and reflecting on them. So the short introduction is that Jung argued that there are four main types of approach to the world, or ways of thinking, ways of understanding what the world is like and what the world is about. And this idea he drew on from much earlier notions within astrology, which itself drew on much earlier notions from within Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, the ideas of Empedocles and a whole variety of other people who utilised those ideas not just in astrology but also in medicine and all sorts of other routes and ways. And whilst it's probably a little bit grandiose to refer to it as an ancient Greek psychology, you could class it as a sort of a precursor to modern notions of psychology and modern ways of understanding people. So Jung took those ideas, polished them up a bit, worked on them, and presented them in the form that he did. The terminology he uses, that there are thinking type people who are very intellectually inclined, feeling people who operate mainly through their emotions and their ability to connect to others at an emotional level, humans and various other animals, etc. There are sensation types who are very hands-on, very practical, very focused on things that they can touch and smell and see and taste and have physical experience of. And there are intuitive types who live very much in their imagination, very kind of fiery leaps of imagination, who grasp ideas very quickly without the careful processes used by the thinking types. Then they sort of leap to the end result quite quickly and are very moved by their quite powerful imaginative capacities. And the idea for the Jungian Circle is that each month we'll look at a different one in turn, and then move on to other subjects after that. So starting with the thinking type, Jung describes this as an approach to life which addresses the world primarily through the intellect, through wanting to understand, analyse, label, identify, if you want. I'm hesitating to use the word compartmentalise because that has a bit of negative baggage for some people, but a little bit like a scientist or a philosopher who wants to categorise the world and work out how, what things are, put a name to them, how they interrelate to each other, organise them into structures, into patterns, into hierarchies sometimes, and understand the world in a rather dispassionate way. So whereas the feeling type is intensely passionate, the thinking type is much more dispassionate and favours rational argument, intellectual evidence to support conclusions rather than going upon their feelings. Now, one of the ideas we can explore as we go along with all four of these elements is that Jung interrelates the four types to 4 other functions. Jung, the number 4 was captured his imagination in all sorts of ways. He puts lots of things into sets of 4. So one of the other things he talks about in terms of sets of 4, and Myers-Briggs, when they were developing their personality inventory, their test, which you can take online if you haven't already, where you answer a load of questions and it tells you what kind of personality type you have based on Jungian ideas. Myers-Briggs ran with this notion and developed it even more so than Jung himself did. There is the idea of the dominant function. So one of these 4 features, we all partake of all 4 of them, but one of them will be most dominant in the personality. It's the go-to approach to the world. So for some of the thinking people, the intellect is their dominant function, is the one that's easiest for them, the one they have most experience of. Present them with an issue, a problem, and the first thing they do is to think of it in a very intellectual, rational, logical, analytical fashion and deal with it that way. Whereas the feeling person would approach their emotions, the sensation person would approach to the realm of the senses and physicality and so forth. Next down the line you have what is referred to as auxiliary functions, which are still quite strong and take a supportive, nurturing role towards supporting the primary function, the dominant function. The tertiary function is undeveloped. It exists in a rather simplistic fashion. It gets very little effort put into developing it. And finally you have the inferior function, which is the part of the self, or one of these 4 factors, which the person is very uncomfortable with. And really doesn't like turning to that aspect of themselves, and often finds other people for whom that is a much more developed faculty, finds them quite off-putting, may have rather negative views of those people, and sees it in a rather grim light. Now, there is a bit of an interesting element which I think perhaps we could bring out in discussion in the Jungian Circle, but I'll just flag it up here for general reflection. John Beebe, who is another quite ardent Jungian analyst and theorist, writes lots of books on the subject, has taken an approach in which he links the dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior functions to archetypal ideas. And his approach is a little bit different from Jung's approach. So it is coming at it from different angles, and we can perhaps discuss in the group whether people prefer the Jungian, kind of classical Jungian approach, or they prefer Beebe's approach, and the sort of pros and cons of either angle. The undeveloped aspect, the inferior function, for Jung is often very much associated with the archetype of the shadow. So the dominant function is the archetype of the hero, the bit we're most confident in and we feel most heroic, whether we're male or female, hero, heroine, that's the bit we feel strongest in. We kind of approach the world, tackle it head on through that ability, that function. And we really like other people who do the same thing. We kind of connect with them, we understand where they're coming from in the world. The least developed, the inferior, for Jung is closely allied to the idea of the shadow, the dark side of the self, the bit of ourself that we are ashamed of, that we feel to be embarrassing, awkward, peculiar, difficult, that we don't really like, that we've often come to, in many respects, demonize and see as really rather awful. And that could be as a result of cultural upbringing, of family attitudes, that certain traits, certain types of people, certain ways of thinking, how we've been told again and again and again growing up by parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, school teachers, the scoutmaster, the vicar, whoever else, we've been told by the influential people around us is just not very good. There's something a bit unpleasant, a bit unsavoury. People who approach the world in that way, they're maybe not very nice people, or they're rather stupid people, or in some other capacity they're just undesirables. Or if we want to put it in an American context, deplorables. They're a basket of deplorables. There was that Hillary Clinton, wasn't it, who came out with that phrase. So we tend to avoid those qualities both in ourselves but also in other people, within whom those qualities are quite strong and quite prominent. Now, Jung's argument is that the process of individuation of personal development requires that over the course of the decades of our lives, we get to the point where we can start to develop that which is undeveloped. We can work on the inferior function, improve it, build it up, and become more balanced individuals. So rather than being very lopsided with one function very dominant and one function hardly existing at all and deeply repressed, we bring them more into a degree of equilibrium. And so the things we fear most, the things we resent most, the things we've been told are most shameful and embarrassing and useless and whatever else, are the things we need eventually to work on. Now, there's no rush. From a Jungian point of view, you've got the whole of your life. Well, depends how long you live, but potentially you've got the whole of your life to work these things on, so you don't have to rush at them like a bull at a gate, but you need to start working on them. And realise that the people in whom those qualities are very dominant, people you might feel very uncomfortable around and dislike and instinctively avoid, are not bad people. They're just different in their way of thinking, different in their way of approaching the world, and they have good qualities to offer. One of the images that often gets used in Jungian discussions is that of a dragon in a cave sleeping on a pile of gold, and the hero comes in, the brave knight or whatever they are, the warrior, and they battle with the dragon. And eventually they defeat the dragon and they claim the dragon's gold. And the idea of the dragon, obviously the scary monster, is the shadow side. And the battling with it is not to destroy it, is not to kill it, but rather to defeat your fear of it, so that you no longer see it as a frightening thing. You start to see it as a source of positive qualities, a source of useful traits. And the imagery of the gold is the treasure of the dragon, the useful things that you will then come to realise are actually part of that bit of yourself, that quality, that trait, whichever one of the four functions we're talking about, which you have maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of your life been avoiding. And suddenly you realise actually there's good things there. There is gold in the cave, there is treasure to be had, and in yourself, and also in those other people for whom that function is very dominant, those people you've been largely avoiding for however many years of your life. So it's seeing the good in the bad. So if you want to put it into Taoist terms, the image of the yin and the yang, and that you've got the dark side and the light side, and there's a spot of dark in the light and a spot of light in the dark. The part of the teaching in Taoism is that each thing contains the essence of its opposite. Hot and cold, day and night, male and female, etc., etc. You can find an element of the opposite in each side. So it's achieving a sense of balance, realising there is good within the thing that you have been taught is bad. And equally, of course, there are bad things in the forces you have been taught are good, because anything in excess becomes overbearing and destructive. But that's perhaps a subject for a different discussion. One of the processes that Jung talks about is anantiodromia. This wonderful word. You could win a game of Scrabble hands down with that. Anantiodromia is the process he identifies in the world, which sees the world as very interconnected between what is inside of us and what's going on around us. There are processes that would probably give a lot of very rational people headaches trying to come to terms with and explain. But this is a very intuitive idea rather than a rational idea. That which is within us is reflected by that which is around us and outside us, and processes within us cause changes to happen in the world around us. So part of the stage of maturation, part of the stage of individuation, is the undeveloped part of yourself, the inferior part of yourself, demands to be addressed. You might have dreams, nightmares, recurrent images. You might find yourself very drawn to certain films, certain books, TV shows, whatever, which have recurrent themes that keep cropping up in them. But not only is what's going on up here, but also it starts to ripple out into the world around you, in that you start drawing towards you people who are quite strong on the things that you're weak on. but you might not appreciate them. You might not kind of think, oh, what a lovely person, I can learn from you. Quite the opposite. You're likely to think, what an absolute git. I can't stand you. You're awful and overbearing and stupid and terrible, and I don't like you. And the more you dislike that bit in yourself, the more you'll dislike it in them. But they keep cropping up, those sorts of people being drawn into your life. And of course, you, conversely, might represent to them their dark side. So they might dislike you as much as you dislike them, because what's strong in you is weak in them, and vice versa. So you're kind of having this two-way street going on. It will keep cropping up. This is Jung's argument. This process of Nanchidramia, that which is undeveloped, keeps manifesting in your life until the day when you start working on it and taking responsibility for it and trying to develop it yourself, rather than ignoring it, repressing it, shoving it down into the cellar of your unconscious mind. You address it and it comes to the fore. Now, mention the differences in John Beebe's approach and Jung's approach, in that whilst Jung tends to associate the inferior function very much with the shadow side, the dark side, Beebe, he sees it more linked to the anima or animus. So if you're a man, it's linked to your anima, your inner feminine. If you're a woman, it's linked to your animus, your inner male. And the anima or animus, there are discussions here around gay people, straight people, bisexual people. Almost all of Jung's clients, he did occasionally mention a little bit about gay people, but by and large he was dealing with straight people. He argued that the straight man, his anima, is his sort of fantasy woman, his ideal woman. The heterosexual woman, her animus is her fantasy man, her dream man. If you're gay, well, John Beebe is gay, and there's all sorts of discussions around that as to how the genders play out in gay people, but we'll park that to one side because that's an issue we can always discuss on another occasion. But let's just say your inner fantasy figure and leave the genders to one side for a moment. So the inner fantasy figure, that which you would like in a partner, represents qualities in yourself which are very undeveloped, which is why BB links it to the inferior function. But rather than it being a thing you're scared of, it's a thing you desire. And so you want it in your life. But as Jung himself says, the kind of mistake we make in the early decades of our lives is that we keep seeking for things that we don't have outside of ourselves rather than turning within. So let's say you've got somebody who is not very practical. They're a bit weak on the sensation function. They're not very strong there. They will look for someone who is very hands-on, very practical, very earthy, maybe a plumber, a builder, a carpenter, someone who's very hands-on, very good at making things. And they'll want those sorts of people as a lover, as a friend, as someone to hang around with, because those qualities are very attractive. And rather than trying to become more hands-on and sensation function themselves, they're sort of importing those qualities from somebody else. And that's not automatically a bad thing, that's just what people do. But Jung's point is that ultimately you should, as the decades roll on, come to realise that you have those qualities in yourself too, and they just need working on. They need improving, developing, building up, and that it is better to build them up in yourself than to keep relying on other people to play out those functions in your lives. Because other people, well, they have lives of their own. They come, they go, they get ill, they die, they leave, they move away, they do whatever. They won't always be there for you to rely on. And so it's better for you to develop those qualities yourself rather than keep relying on them being brought in from the outside by other people. Now, those two approaches, Beebe's idea of this inner fantasy figure and Jung's approach of the dark side, the shadow side, are not necessarily contradictory. Because one thing, obviously, which you can see time and again happening with people, possibly yourself or friends, family, whoever, is a tendency to have a bit of a love-hate thing going on. That the qualities a person most desire can sometimes be a quality that they end up very much resenting. That by desiring somebody else, bringing them into your life at the first, it's wonderful, it's romantic, it's fantastic, but it can also highlight your sense of vulnerability. if they leave or whatever, people become possessive. They're afraid that the partner will leave them and cling on like grim death, and it becomes a destructive thing, because it highlights the fact that you are vulnerable, and often feelings of vulnerability then trigger feelings of resentment, feelings of fear, and it's the shadow side. And so you both love and hate that thing within you that you know you need, so you love it, but in the very act of needing it, you're left vulnerable, and so you hate it. So there is an element in which those two approaches, is it the shadow, is it the anima animus, it could kind of be both at the same time. There can be an element of that. Now, coming back, I'm talking in very generalised terms here, coming back to the idea of the thinking function, Jung makes the argument that these functions, again based on ancient Greek ideas from Empedocles about the four humours and astrological approaches and so on, that it absorbed those same ideas, that they exist in pairs. So the thinking function is paired with the feeling function, the sensing function is paired with the intuition function. They are the opposites of each other. So if you are strong on the thinking function, you will be weak on the feeling function, and vice versa. Now, to add an added level of subtlety, nuance, or if you prefer, complexity, we also factor in, from Jung's point of view, introversion and extroversion. Any of these qualities can be expressed in an introverted way, turning the quality inside yourself, or it can be expressed in an extroverted way, putting the quality outside yourself into the world around you. So some thinking type people are very introverted, some thinking type people are very extroverted. And so what we end up with in terms of the dominant function and the inferior function is that if your dominant function is introverted thinking, your inferior function is extroverted feeling, on the grid you've got there, the diagonal opposite. Likewise, if someone's dominant function is extroverted thinking, their inferior function will be introverted feeling. So in talking about thinking, you've kind of got to talk about feeling and vice versa, because these are two sides of a coin. So the extroverted thinker could have a love-hate relationship with introverted feelers, both those traits within themselves that are undeveloped, but also when they bump into people, friends, relatives, colleagues at work, lovers, whatever they may be, people who are introverted feelers, it could be a bit of a love-hate thing going on there, that partly they're attracted to them, but also they resent them and don't know how to get to grips with them and don't really understand them and find them very frustrating and very difficult and very awkward. And perhaps culturally, either culture in the big sense of umpty million people, or just in the small scale of the culture within their very specific family, it may be that they've been brought up, those extroverted thinkers, to regard the traits associated with introverted feeling as wrong in some way, as part of the shadow, as part of the darkness, as either immoral or just worthless, stupid, useless, in some capacity a negative function. And this is part of the debate. Jung sees some of this as biological. People are born with predispositions one way or another, but also there is a nature-nurture element here going on, that not only are you born with a predisposition to certain ways, but it's also actively encouraged through nurture, that certain traits will be nurtured to grow dominant, other traits will be, whatever the opposite of nurture is, repressed to be kept under wraps. So whenever the child shows certain traits, it's slapped down and they're told, no, don't do that, do this. Do the dominant thing, ignore the inferior thing. And so by the time they're 18, 19, 20, those patterns are set quite solidly as an approach to their adult life. So if we look at the two types of thinking, introverted and extroverted, the extroverted thinker, you could typify as the more in a very loose term, scientific approach to it, and that doesn't mean they necessarily have a job as a scientist, although they could do. But it's more a sort of scientific style approach to life, to the world, to yourself, to want to analyse everything, categorise it, know where it fits. So a little bit like a zoologist who wants to know what's a mammal, what's a reptile, what's a bird, what's a fish, which box do I put this creature in? It's an approach to life that says, well, here's an experience, here's a person, here's a phenomena. Which box do I put it in? Which label do I put it in? And that relates to other things in the same box, which is different from those things over there in that different box. So it's about analysing the world, knowing how to label, how to identify, how to put things. And that includes people. How do you label people? And obviously there's a bit of a, without getting distracted, there is a lot of debate going on at the moment around gender labels and things like that. Is somebody a man or a woman or a non-binary or genderqueer, this, that, the other thing? That's the wish to label. And there are other people who go, oh, don't label me at all. I don't want you. Don't put me in a box. Don't slap a label on my head. That, you could say, is a reaction of the introverted feeling to the extroverted thinker. So the extroverted thinker wants to put a label on stuff to know which box to stuff you in, but the introverted feeler shies away from labels and sees them as restrictive, suffocating, oppressive, whatever word you want to use, and feels that they really want to reject the labels that are being put upon them. They don't want any. It's not that they want a different label. They just don't want any label at all, and back away from those sorts of reactions. So that you can see an element of that kind of playing out in social media and other phenomena these days, not just around gender and other issues too. But it's an example of the approach to life of wanting to label, wanting to organise, wanting to know how this thing relates to that thing. There is a tendency towards hierarchical approaches. This thing is more important than that thing, and which, again, for those who are more anarchic approach, which you could say is the sort of introverted feeling approach, hierarchies scare some people, whereas other people love them. And hierarchies, both in terms of knowledge hierarchies, which topic is more important than which number is bigger than which, that kind of thing. Hierarchies of people at the social level. For some people, how do you run a community? Whether it's a chess club or an entire country, how do you run a community? You need people in charge, you need organisation, there has to be a place for everything and everything in its place, including people. You need people knowing what their place is in life in that very kind of Victorian and I know my place, governor sort of approach. People know where they fit. Obviously not everyone likes that. For some people that feels very, very suffocating, and that's more your introverted feeling, is to react against hierarchies, pull away from hierarchies, not want to be either in charge of anyone else or underneath anyone else, and a resistance to that. One of the popular images I've heard various Jungian writers use for extroverted thinking is the idea of Mr. Spock of Star Trek. Very cold, very rational, and again, the cold is the downside. So the feeling type might regard the thinking type as a bit of a cold fish, because they're very rational, they're very logical, they don't get impassioned. You're trying to have a conversation about some very personal subject, and they approach it in a very rational, logical, calm, sedate way. They don't get worked up, they don't get impassioned, whereas the feeling person gets very worked up, very impassioned, very emotional. And to them, that is normal, whereas to the thinking person, that's just muddying the waters. It's, they're trying to work out in their head what's going on, and this silly bugger over here just keeps weeping and wailing and getting heated and angry, and all those emotions just get in the way, and the thinking person doesn't want to know about all those emotions. It's just, they'll go away. Whereas the feeling person, that's exactly what they do want to know about. I can't remember who said it originally. I can remember it being quoted in The History Boys, both the play and the film version of it, but I can't remember who they're quoting off the top of my head. They're talking about the Holocaust as part of a history class. And somebody says, I don't want to meet the person who can discuss the Holocaust in a calm and rational way. Because obviously in history classes, the tendency to approach talking about history in a very calm, rational way, very kind of, this event caused that event, which caused that event, and you sort of put them in a chain of action, reaction, and you evaluate what was going on, and why did this king do that, and why did that queen do the other, and blah, blah, blah. Whoever it was that made the original quote that appears in the play is reacting against some historian who's trying to analyse the Holocaust in a very logical, rational, calm fashion. And the point of the quote is that this is such a god-awful event, this death, torture, carnage, just horror upon horror upon horror upon horror. How can anyone, aside from a robot, talk about any of that dreadful, dreadful stuff without getting upset, without getting drawn into the emotional drama, the tragedy, the abuse, the exploitation, the slaughter of children and frail old people, and just the sheer horror of it all. That's very much a feeling reaction, the emotional response to something which is intensely emotional, and the feeling that anyone who doesn't have an emotional response to that must be a robot, just a kind of a walking machine, lacking in human decency. And that's part of that sort of thinking, feeling dichotomy going on there. So, trying to come back to the plot now. So the extroverted thinking type is about sort of organising the world, understanding the world, understanding people, putting them in boxes. It's very cold, impassionate, impersonal, dispassionate, orderly, very orderly. In terms of fiction, I'm thinking Hercule Poirot. Everything is ordered, structured, in place, always fiddling and organising and putting things in straight lines, organising not only the physical world is very neat, everything in relation to each other, but his ideas as he's analysing murders, and he's not getting drawn into the tragedy and the sorrow of the murder, the grief of the murder. He's just thinking he's an intellectual machine like Sherlock Holmes. He's a thinking machine, approaching, analysing, interrelating facts, getting the big picture. That's essentially extroverted thinking, that approach. Introverted thinking is more philosophical. One of the arguments, putting a professional hat on in terms of research methodologies, in research within psychology and sociology, criminology, etc., you've got a style called the grounded method, a grounded approach, in which you come at a subject without preconception. You come at it and think, well, what's the facts? X, Y, Z, those are the facts. How do I turn these facts into a broader picture explanation of what's going on? You start with the facts and then you build up to a picture which explains what's going on. That's contrasted against an approach which is a more common approach than grounded theory, in which people have strong ideological opinions. They may be passionate feminists, passionate Marxists, passionate functionalists, whatever, doesn't really matter what it is. They've got a big idea, a grand idea in their head. And so they approach a problem with that grand idea in their head. And then they start looking for facts that fit the grand idea. And obviously any facts that don't fit the grand idea tend to be ignored, brushed under the carpet. So they've already decided the explanation for what's going on here is a feminist one, a Marxist one, a functionalist one, a whatever one. And they're trying to find the evidence to support that. They're looking for certain types of evidence in the first place. And the introverted thinker is a bit more like that. It's the philosopher who already has an idea in mind about how the world works and is looking for concepts, ideas, experiences that help to support their pre-existing set of values. They've got the theory, they've got the concept, and they're interested in finding the evidence to support the concept to fit in with what they already believe. This doesn't explain where that concept came from in the first place. That's another issue again. But that's how they're approaching the world, that they have a strong conceptualization of what the world is, and they seek evidence, elements of events, people, data to support their understanding of the world. It fits in with what they see. As introverts, they tend to be a bit more withdrawn, so the extrovert is out there talking, exploring, examining, engaging, meeting with people, tends to be a very jolly social sort. The introvert is more sitting in the library, reading books, reading journal articles, papers, websites, sort of lost in a realm of ideas in which they by and large try to avoid people. They try to avoid social engagements. They like thinking, they don't like socially engaging. Why they don't like socially engaging is because they don't fully understand the needs and requirements of other people. So the opposing side of the introverted thinker, the undeveloped inferior element, is the extroverted feeler. The extroverted feeler is very, very sociable. They're a bit of a party animal. They like people, they like being around people, they like relating to people, they get them, and they like to make other people feel valued, buy them nice gifts, put them at their ease, hosting dinner parties, getting everyone happy and jolly. Oh, we'll sit this person next to that person because I know they'll get on really well together. They probably like a bit of matchmaking. Oh, I think you're single. Oh, you're single, aren't you? I'll matchmake you up because I know you'll really click. They're very good at reading people, very good at engaging emotionally. They're not necessarily, how should we say this, perhaps not always the brightest people on earth, the most well-read, whereas the introverted thinker frequently is very well-read, very well-informed on whatever their favourite subject is. Not necessarily that they've got a massive IQ, they like to learn. They like to pick up ideas. Ideas interest them more than people interest them. Whereas the extroverted feeler is more interested in people than they are in ideas. So they kind of collect people, I suppose, in a way. They like having lots of certain sorts of people around them, people they can relate to, people they can engage with. They're somewhat prone to sentimentality, which the introverted thinker really doesn't do sentimentality at all and regards it as a waste of time. But the extroverted feeler invests themselves emotionally in places, in people, in objects. They want to have cherished mementos around them. And people can be mementos, photos can be mementos, gifts can be mementos, things that are stimuli to memory. So they can sit there and look in their photo album, or, these days I suppose, look at the phone, the photos on the phone, look at pebbles they've picked up on beaches and think, oh, that was from that holiday, and this was from here, and that was from there. And it promotes this realm of warm feelings that come from feeling loved and from giving love, from giving and receiving affection towards the people around them. And it's very much about nurture and wanting to actively nurture other people. Whereas the introverted thinker could give you a lot of advice, a ton of information about things if they were so inclined, but if you start getting upset and weeping and wailing, then they tend to run for the doors because they've got zero interest in your emotions and don't really know how to deal with it, which, again, thinking fictional characters, perhaps is very much the Sherlock Holmes type, who, confronted by weepy, waily clients, sort of says, oh, go and talk to Dr. Watson, leave me alone. I'm just here to solve your problems, I don't give a damn about your emotions. You go sort yourself out somewhere else. Not likely to be good therapists, shall we say. If you want advice on computers or cars or some intellectual abstract subject, they're brilliant. So they could be very good teachers in terms of imparting intellectual information, but they've got very little wish to emotionally connect to people. So you've got those developed and undeveloped, dominant and inferior qualities going on. And I said that balance between John Beebe and Jung's ideas of is it the anima animus, the desired force that is sought out in relationships, or is it more the shadow, the dark thing we fear because we don't know how, we don't understand it, we don't get it, so we avoid it like the plague? Perhaps a bit of both, in that you could perhaps find relationships in which somebody who is very extrovert thinking dates or befriends someone who's very introverted feeling. Half the time doesn't really understand them at all, but finds them a bit mysterious and strange and is drawn to them, but also occasionally resents them and feels that they're a pain in the bum and cause more misery than they're worth, and vice versa, of course, because it's a two-way street in terms of how two people relate to each other. Or you'd get the introverted thinking type drawn to the extroverted feeling type, and again, a bit of a love-hate thing going on there. Sometimes they are the dark side, and sometimes they are the desired thing, which they feel the need to, in terms of Jung's enantiodromia, to balance themselves out. So it becomes almost a learning experience. You meet someone who's very strong in the thing you're very weak at. One very useful thing you can do is learn from them. Study them, observe them, start to think, how could I become more like them to develop that bit of me, which they're very good at, but I'm not very good at. So it becomes a bit of an inspired, or could become a bit of an inspired learning experience. Looking at the time, I think I probably waffled on way more than I should have done on this one. But hopefully that's given people in the circle who might get the chance to listen to this before the meeting to have an understanding. Probably you already knew all of this anyway, but for those of you who are more new to Carl Jung, gives you a bit more of an understanding of the thinking function and how it approaches the world and how it relates to its undeveloped, its inferior functions of the undeveloped feeling type. And then when we meet up, we can discuss it in a bit more depth. If there's anyone listening to this who's not part of the Suffolk Jungian Circle, but you've got a few questions, by all means, post them on the blog, and I will, or post them on YouTube, and I will endeavour to answer them for you.